everybody. This is your favorite root vegetable, Garrett, the carrot, joined here with Keith, who is our stick, also known as the Bittensor guru. Happy
Your
New Year,
favorite
Keith.
pointy object.
Favorite pointy object. That's perfect. Well, Happy New Year, everybody. I hope you had a good holidays. I know we sure did. Good to be back here for our third episode ever. We've got a lot to cover. Before we dive into a kind of a recap of 2025 and go into those topics, I want to start by talking about SubnetMovingAlpha, which is an interesting parameter that might get a little bit of the weeds on the chain, but might answer some questions based on some recent activity in the ecosystem. And then once we get through that, we'll take a look at 2025 and how that went for us, and then how that affected subnets. We'll talk about the subnet limit, what that should really be, and we'll talk about what to do with subnets that have zero emissions but are not getting deregistered. So it should be an exciting conversation. So let's get started with SubnetMovingAlpha. What is it, and why does it matter? Why are we talking about this right now? If you are paying attention to the comings and goings on X or on Discord, you may have noticed that Subnet 67 was recently deregistered, and it was deregistered pretty quickly. And there were some questions about how a subnet could be deregistered that quickly. For those of you who don't know, there was an exploit on that subnet, and I don't want to go into all the details about that because there's investigations still going and whatnot, but there's a lot of stuff that happened on Subnet 67 that resulted in a severe price drop, which ultimately resulted in its deregistration within a matter of hours. And that raised some questions, not just about the details of the Subnet 67 drama, but about the mechanism of how subnets get deregistered, and was this an intervention by the foundation? Was this an intervention by the triumvirate? Or did this naturally occur? And to answer that for you guys, the Subnet 67 deregistration was a natural occurrence. Did not involve manual intervention from the triumvirate or OTF. This was a mechanism that has been baked in the chain since February of last year. And the mechanism that allowed for this is the EMA, which is, as we covered in the previous episode, is the exponential moving average. So it's the moving average price, the EMA price of that subnet, that is what was the ultimate cause of the deregistration of the subnet. So the chain will be looking for essentially the bottom tier subnet that's next on the chopping block. And it does this by ranking subnets based on price EMA. So what is the moving average price of that subnet? And if it's the lowest, then it's on the chopping block for deregistration. And Subnet 67 became on that chopping block. Now, I think the confusion that a lot of people have is, how is it possible that a subnet like 67, which was doing okayish, could have a sudden price decrease and then get deregged almost immediately after, or seemingly immediately after, within a matter of hours? How is that possible? And it's possible with a value called SubnetMovingAlpha. So for all you Rust developer nerds that want to go look at chain code, that's the golden ticket to look for, is SubnetMovingAlpha. It's a parameter. It's a parameter that's set by pseudo. It's a universal parameter. And what SubnetMovingAlpha is a coefficient that basically just determines how expressive the current price is in EMA calculation. And we'll throw up a visual of how EMA is calculated. But the EMA of any given thing, in this case price, is a coefficient times the current value plus the kind of the inverse, but 1 minus that coefficient times the previous value, or the previous EMA calculated value. So the higher the coefficient is, in which in this case it's SubnetMovingAlpha, the higher that value is, the more expressive the current value, the current price will be, and the less expressive the previous EMA calculated value will be. And so, and the less that value is, then the more expressive the previous historical value will be. And so In February of last year, that value, subnet moving alpha, was increased by 2 orders of magnitude. And that allowed the moving average price, EMA, to catch up to the current price in a matter of about 10 hours instead of 30 to 40 days. And that's where we get this rapid deregistration of subnet 67, is you have a huge drop in the price, and then through that, we have the EMA catching up very quickly in a matter of hours. So what does this mean? Well, it means, for one, that this was not a manual intervention with subnet 67, but it also means that the EMA is heavily expressing the current price. So when you have a new price that is current, that is going to be setting the tone for the EMA. And why was this change? Why was this increase 100x about a week and a half after the launch of DTAO? And this was done because at the time, emissions was determined by the price EMA, whereas now it is determined by tau flow. But at the time, it was determined by price EMA. And so what people were doing at the early days of DTAO, for anyone here that remembers, is
besides making and losing a lot of money.
Besides making and losing a lot of money, is they would ride the EMA wave to get more emissions than they might otherwise deserve based on what the market input was. So the market might tank a subnet, might sell the tokens and whatnot, but the emissions would linger for days or weeks. And that would boost that subnet artificially. And so when we increase the subnet moving alpha value, you're increasing the effectiveness of the current price in that calculation. And so when the price of a subnet goes down, now all of a sudden that lingering of emissions doesn't stay, or at least doesn't stay for very long. And so that was something that had to be fixed, and that's where we have the increase of subnet moving alpha to be 100x over the previous value, and that's where we get price EMA catching up in a matter of about 10 hours instead of about 30 or 40 days. So where does this bring us now? Well, right now we have tau flow that is determining the emissions for a subnet, and the price EMA is effectively used just to determine which subnets should be on the chopping block. So this gaming of emissions that happened in the very early days of DTAO is not really a thing anymore. And so we had a call actually just this morning with the community, and we collectively decided that we would lower the value of the subnet moving alpha to be about a quarter of what it currently is. And this will allow for a couple of days of market reaction or of EMA adjustment to the market for that moving price. And the idea behind this is that 10 hours is not enough time for the market to respond to a price change, but 2 days most likely will be. And we can adjust this if needed. But this is interesting here because subnet moving alpha used to be critical in determining the emissions of a subnet, but that is no longer the case because now it is a tau flow based emission system. And so now we have price EMA effectively just being used for subnet deregistration determinations, and we can kind of start to reset that value back to being lower. So I kind of threw a lot out there that is kind of deep chain knowledge, but I think it's important for us as a community to understand how subnet deregistrations work and how emissions work and how this really affects subnets. And I think that we're starting to see that in a certain coming and going of subnets, and it's important that we as a community understand how that works. So that's subnet moving alpha. Keith, anything to?
Yeah,
add?
I was able to keep up with you through most of it. So we're really talking about 3 different things here. There's price EMA, and subnet moving alpha. And those are all, price is a pretty easy calculation. right? It's just based on the alpha and the tau in the subnet liquidity pool at that exact moment. So there's no, additional variables, right? Maybe you could explain just a little bit more about the price. And is there anywhere to actually see price EMA? Because I just jumped on tau stats. I don't see it, at least on the subnet page. I looked, this was a little bit ago, but at least on tau app, I didn't see that as available as a calculation or a column that you could add into the main subnet page either. So where do you actually see the price EMA?
That's a great question. It's actually not something that people really talk about that much. It's an internal chain value. I don't even think it's really exposed. I think it's something you'd have to calculate yourself if you wanted to get that value. But that's an interesting feature request for those of us who are in the tool building world of Bittensor. Is this might be interesting. But this is not a value that is fetched really super easily. Or as far as I know, this is not something I've encountered on Tau Stats or these other tools like Tau and whatnot. So it's basically the idea of how EMA works in general is you have whatever the previous EMA was is kind of reconciled with the current price.
Mm-hmm.
So if the current price is 0.01 and it was 0.02 previously, then basically what the idea is you have the coefficient times the current price plus 1 minus the coefficient times the previous EMA value. And that's the new EMA value.
What exactly is a coefficient in this
Yeah, so
scenario?
the coefficient in this case is the subnet moving alpha value, but a coefficient in general is just a value that is placed as a multiplier on another value.
Mm.
And so subnet moving alpha is multiplied by the current price and then 1 minus that value, which that value is somewhere between 0 and 1. So when you have 1 minus that value, you get kind of this like inverse effect, and that's multiplied as a coefficient by the previous EMA price.
And the calculation for this up until the, I guess, change that was agreed to this morning was that the current price was like 100 times more impactful. You said 2 orders of magnitude, 100 times more impactful than whatever the previous average price was for the subnet.
Whatever the previous subnet moving alpha value
Oh,
was.
subnet moving alpha. Okay. Okay, I see.
Right.
And now it's effectively 25x what it was, a year ago, I guess? Or is that the value we're comparing it to?
That's the value that it will be. It hasn't been changed just yet, but that's the value that was agreed to with the community as of today.
Yeah. And essentially the problem is that if you have not only do you want to give the community time to notice and act upon price changes, but you could have some malicious actors acquiring a large amount of alpha on a subnet and then dumping that alpha, let's say over a holiday or, some kind of religious celebration, I don't know, or even just a weekend, whatever. And then, the owner maybe doesn't have time to organize its resources to, let's say, bring the price back up, or the community doesn't have time to act on the lower price. Then you find yourself, deregistered before you got a chance to do anything about it. So that's what we're worried about here, really, right?
You're exactly right. And the thing is that 10 hours, especially in this international ecosystem that we're a part of, is just not enough time, because that you could be like normally operating as a subnet and then deregistered within the space of you just being asleep, depending on where you live in the world. And that's not really where we want to be in it as an ecosystem. So having at least 2 days gives you time where it's like, okay, all the time zones have been awake at some point within this period, and there's a little bit of wiggle room there for
Yeah.
some reaction.
Yeah, and I think some people may be thinking like, well, what does it matter anyway? These are the, the bottom 3 to 5 to maybe 10 subnets in Bittensor. Are they all just going to be deregistered in the next month anyway? Like, is this a big deal? But actually, there's quite a bit of like gamification and sort of like opportunity down at that level. If you're actually looking for maybe like some non-traditional investments into subnets, you can start doing a little calculation as to, how much tau is going to be distributed to the holders of alpha. So basically how much tau is in the pool at the time of deregistration. And there are many subnets on Bittensor where if you just look at the price of the subnet, like if everyone was to like quote sell their alpha, they would actually receive, if you were to sell your alpha, you'd receive less tau than if you just deregistered the subnet right then. So there's some sort of like, financial gamesmanship going on at these bottom rungs. And so, yeah, I do think that these numbers are important because I see the at-risk stuff on tau stats that'll show you when a subnet is flirting with disaster. But maybe some more hard numbers there, I would think would be appreciated by the community for sure.
Absolutely, absolutely. And like we said, that I haven't experienced price EMA as being something that's visible on these other tools. But if that's a feature that's hidden somewhere, then if someone wants to comment on this video, feel free to do so. But I think that that little warning that tau sets can provide and other tools can provide um, is using that metric. And it's important for us to understand just how this works, because when you see a subnet that goes from everything's hunky-dory to, oh, there's something really big and dramatic happening, it's scary, and then all of a sudden it's deregistered, it feels like manual intervention. It feels like a subnet was shut down rather than just simply deregistered. So it's really important that we understand how things work, so that we don't end up pointing fingers in different directions as a community, where we can understand that, like, okay, this makes sense.
Yeah, and for
So
context here too, in case this is like worrying people or something, I think it was like more than 1.5 million alpha that was like sort of liquidated, that was used to remove tau from the pool, essentially for Subnet 67, which was, call it roughly like half of their alpha supply, circulating supply. So it was a huge movement. It wasn't just like, 10% of the supply or something.
yeah.
So it was really a huge outlier as far as alpha movement is concerned, and probably the largest single movement of alpha in the shortest amount of time that has ever occurred in dynamic tau, at least up to this point.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great point, that something as drastic as what happened with Subnet 67 is not what I would consider to be normal market behavior. There was some
Yeah,
very
right.
abnormal activities going on there. Um, but this might be a good opportunity for us to segue into kind of the next phase of this conversation, which is looking back at 2025, plucking out some things that are some good conversation topics for how we want to approach 2026, using what we've learned for subnet emissions and how that affects everything. So let's take a look at 2025. What happened? 2025 was a really big year. It was a foundational year for Bittensor. It reshaped the game. We had the launch of DTAO, which now it feels like ages ago, but that was just last year in February. We're not even 12 months into DTAO. It feels like that's just part of the DNA of Bittensor at this point, but we are 11 months into this, and that was setting the tone for 2025. And 2025 brought a lot of other foundational changes, like we saw the rise of 128 subnets as the limit, whereas the previous limit was 64, and not much before that was 32. So we've seen a almost Cambrian explosion of subnets since the launch of DTAO, which is really exciting. And then we've seen a lot of new features being brought into the chain, like minor burn as being a new kind of economic mechanism that's been played with. And then we've seen subnet mechanisms come into play, which are like subnets within subnets. It's kind of interesting where if you have a subnet that you want to play two games at once, you can do that in Bittensor. And then we have Tau Flow, which we've covered on this pod before, but that's the new emission system, where really emissions are determined by activity, not just price. Because there are subnets that can maintain a price without having a lot of activity, which we'll go into in a little bit here. But what I'd like to explore here is if I could just pluck out a couple of things from 2025, is the subnet limit, subnet mechanisms. I think this brings a big question for us as to what do we want to see in Bittensor? What is a metric of success? Is it quantity of subnets? Is it quality of subnets? And that if you only had 3 or 4 big winners, is that what we want to see in Bittensor? What do we want to see in Bittensor? Because we saw the rise of a lot of subnets, some good, some not so good. What does that mean for Bittensor? What should that mean for 2026? I'm curious, Keith, what your thoughts are here, because I kind of go back and forth. I kind of think that in some ways we're always going to have a Pareto distribution of subnets where we have like these top subnets that are just really kicking butt, and then we have like this long tail of subnets that are really not doing so hot. Um, but what does that look like when you expand to beyond just 128, when you expand to 256, 512, 1024, or you completely unbound it? What does that look like? Because at the beginning of DTAO, it was technically unbound, but before it could get to the 128th slot, the limit was placed back on. But what does that look like as we go beyond potentially 128, or should Bittensor stay within 128, or is 128 too many subnets? Let's dive into that.
I don't think about the too many very often because I just sort of look at the kind of grift going on at, let's call it like the bottom quarter, maybe, of subnets. And it's not all subnets down at that level, obviously, but there's a dozen or two that I would say are have been registered for a very long time, are not communicating, are not developing. Some are buying their tokens, some are not. We talked maybe on the last pod or maybe on the first one about subnets kind of playing dead, and that might be some strategy that's actually going on there. In the end, I think it's best to have like an open playing field. And when we start to get to the point where deregistrations start maybe eliminating subnets that do have a positive flow, or we get anywhere close to that point, then I think the conversation can move to should we expand. But obviously, everybody listening to this is also aware of the price of Bittensor. I don't expect us to talk about, or price of Tau. I don't expect us to talk about that very much on this pod, but it is relevant for the number of subnets, in that the emissions that the subnets are receiving is essentially, their operating budget, or their rewards for their stakers, or the rewards for the owners for running the subnet. And if the price of Tau remains relatively static, but you start, we go through a halving, or we go through, an increase, a double in the number of subnets, then, you start to feel the squeeze on the ability for subnets to deliver their services with sort of the existing bandwidth that they love and enjoy when the price is, let's say, above 300 or something. I just saw in a chat the other day that one of subnet owner mentioned that, when the price is under 200, that really puts a lot of pressure on their miners. And a certain amount of pressure is, of course, good. And actually, you can look at you can also kind of look at it in this way of like, well, if you add more subnets and it maybe lowers the price, does it make it easier for the price of each subnet? Does it make it easier for those individual subnets to basically become profitable? Because you sort of have this inverse relationship between, well, they're getting a ton of emissions, so their miners are getting a bunch of emissions, their stakers are getting a bunch, and they're all selling. Well, if you reduce the amount of emissions, it becomes easier to get over that hump and sort of turn on the flywheel. So I can see where that argument does have relevance, but is that what we're really aiming for as a network? And I think what we should be, in my opinion, the priority for all of us at this point is to nurture this Bittensor essentially into a place where you have 128 high quality, competitive, real tough choices of where to put your money. And it's like we talked about in the last pod, it's less of like a horse race where you're betting, days, weeks before the things start running, and you're actually, dealing with real information, and you've got, half of the race done or whatever. And you're able to act on that information, because that's a higher quality level of information. And for an investor who's maybe used to dealing with the stock market, or maybe companies that are a little bit more, traditional or quote legitimate, I think that there's some confusion as to like what happened with 67, and like, well, how does this happen on Bittensor? Who's responsible for this? You know, you are not you, but the community is responsible essentially. If the community is under sort of scrutinizing these subnets and over investing or over speculating in things that are maybe have a high level of marketing but a low level of delivery and substance, we're going to put ourselves in these positions. And unfortunately, I believe that with the current crop of 128, there's quite a few landmines out there where if the community was to swap in size into these subnets, I wouldn't expect that subnet to deliver on their promise. I would expect them to probably run away with that cash. So I guess to end that rant, what I would say is that I don't think we need to increase the limit. Now, if our token price, if we stabilize at a much higher token price for Tau, or we start seeing, like I said, these deregistrations start creeping up into subnets that are actively supported with positive flow of Tau in a meaningful way, then I think that conversation can really begin. But I think what we're dealing with really is a lot of, Bitcoin kind of maxis, or maybe this is their only people's second coin, because there's a lot of members of our community like that only own Bitcoin and only own Tau, and this sort of like, it should be unlimited. Anyone should be able to join. It should be able to expand into infinity if it needs to or wants to. There shouldn't be these artificial sort of limits on basically anything. Now, Bitcoin has its artificial limits as well, like block size or whatever. But, as far as like the number of participants, there is no limit, in mining Bitcoin. So should there be a limit in essentially subnet owners being able to mine Tau? And then you can argue like, well, there is no limit. You just, a deregistration just removes an ineffective actor. So is there a limit if we're just rotating out these poor performers and putting people in who are going to maybe take a better swing at it? I don't know.
Let me ask you this question, because this is really relevant to what you just said about deregistration. Because when a subnet gets deregistered, it's because someone else took their place. They were the lowest on the chopping block and someone else took their spot. Do you think that the registration cost is cost prohibitive for highly performant players that could be in Bittensor but aren't?
I don't think we've gone under 200. I just looked at it this morning. I don't think we've gone under 200 since we've turned registrations back on. If we have, we maybe done it once. But we're like in that high 200, 300 range. I think the current price is like over 500 Tau to snag a subnet.
Right now, it's like 484 Tau. I just looked it up. It's about that 500 Tau mark. But regardless, I mean, that's a pretty hefty amount of cash. I think a lot of people don't have that lying around. Do you think that by expanding the subnet limit, thereby lowering the registration cost, that's a good thing for Bittensor? Or do you think we've got enough to play with as we stand? Because to your point about like what happened with 67, what happened with these other subnets that maybe aren't doing as much, how do they get in? But maybe some researcher that wants to do a project for his startup company can't get in because he doesn't have 480 Tau. What do we want to do about that?
Yeah. And I think when you bring up the researcher part, like, I want as many garage bands to be able to jam at the same time, even if they're not shooting for emissions, even if they, shut off the thing we talked about last pod, which is basically like eventually subnet owners will probably have the ability to not have any auto sell going on, but they can just also kind of remove themselves from the emissions game. And so they're not eligible to earn tau, but any alpha that they, or any tau that they do get into the subnet, doesn't get automatically sold. Am I explaining that properly? That there is that sort of development coming where you're going to have subnet owners having the ability to like voluntarily take zero emissions or take a percentage of emissions, and then that would then impact their root prop?
Yeah, so, well, there's a couple of things there. There is one change that is in the proposal or design phase about changing the balance between the owner emissions, the validator emissions, and the miner emissions, where the owner could potentially surrender some of their 18% in favor of the miners, or something like that. So if that's what you're talking about, then that is in a design phase.
No, I was talking about actually where, and maybe I'm dealing off old information. I'm not a frequent visitor to the church, but the Church of Rao is a Discord channel. For any of you that are developers, you're probably more at home there than I would be. But even if you're not a developer, you can still keep up with a lot of the conversation that's going on in the various channels. And a lot of these things that we're talking about here in this podcast are discussed there, and sometimes even have their own channels within the Church of Rao. So go check it out. You can find an invite probably in the official Discord. Yeah. No, I thought there was going to be an ability for subnets to opt out of emissions at the, basically benefit of having the auto sell turned off, because obviously you don't need to protect subnets from this whole gamification thing if you're not giving them any tau through emissions.
Yeah. Okay.
Right?
Okay. So that is something that's also kind of a design sort of researchy thing that is not in a PR phase right now. But
Okay.
that kind of a feature though is important here because that affects the subnet limit, I think. Imagine you had no subnet limit, or the subnet limit was outrageously high, it was in the thousands. But the only emissions that are granted are tau flow. So you could have hundreds or thousands of subnets that have no effective tau flow or very little tau flow, and they don't get emissions. But I think that tau flow isn't enough. I think that there are some considerations that I think will be needing to be made if we do increase the subnet limit to the 1,000 subnet mark, because what we don't want to have happen is where there's so many subnets that are each getting their own small slice of the pie that no slice is big enough to eat. That's what we don't want to see. If we're going to see a Pareto distribution, we want those key players to get enough emissions to have enough liquidity injected into their pools where it's enticing enough for their miners. That's the big thing, is we want to protect the successful subnets from being diluted by all of this flood of incoming subnets. So that's the risk with increasing the subnet limit. And I think that's where a lot of people come from in opposition to increasing the subnet limit, is that, hey, you're going to dilute the liquidity injections of these other subnets that are otherwise very successful. Whereas the counter argument to that is, right now we have some subnets that are winners and some subnets that are losers. And if we don't increase the limit, we're basically capping how many winners we can have. I don't think that we are going to get to a point where every one of the 128 subnets is a winner, and then that's when you increase the limit. I think that there will always be winners and losers at Bittensor, just like there's winners and losers in the internet, in the stock market, in every ecosystem. There are going to be winners and losers, and that's effectively by design. So the question is, how do we grow as an ecosystem while protecting the winners, but not holding ourselves so high to suggest that we're going to gatekeep the 128 subnets to only absolute winners? Because I think that while desirable, I don't think that that's realistic. So what does that look like for the future? Like in the future of 2026, do you want to see more than 128 subnets on Bittensor, or should we just park it right where it is and focus on what we got on hand?
I wonder if we opened it up at some point so that it wasn't the slots that were limiting, but it was the amount of emissions that you were claiming as your subnet. You know, when you registered it, you essentially had to call yourself like full emission subnet means, you know, the full root prop schedule, and it takes whatever 100 days to get under 50%. Everyone knows the whole thing. We talked about it. So maybe you take it from 128 and you know, I don't know, increase it by 10 every month. I don't know, whatever number it is, you know, and then that increases the ability for slots to be grabbed that are going after full emissions, but it never stops new subnets from coming in that don't want to opt into the emission structure of Bittensor. So that would allow for the research subnets and to benefit from the mechanisms and have this, you know, self-funding or community funding, but they wouldn't be funded, of course, by the protocol. I still go back to like, it's okay. It's a lot of money for, you know, one researcher who's working out of his whatever, and he can't spend 60, 70, 80, $100,000 on a subnet slot, but there's enough people that have enough tau that are willing to fund good ideas that, at least up to this point, I have not seen or even heard of a really good idea not getting funding. And there's probably at least half a dozen different entities, some individuals, some groups. We all know them. Yuma being the largest one with what, I don't know, 12, 15 different subnets at this point. Probably a couple more slots that aren't even filled. I don't know. So the funding is there. Yeah, you might have to, you know, pay a little piece of your subnet or whatever whatever contractual obligations that come with those agreements. But even that, there are actors that are willing to provide very, very favorable agreements that have sort of a low vig for potential subnet owners. So I don't think that good ideas are being kept out of Bittensor at this point. I don't feel like that at all. And I do expect that as we let this sort of mechanism run, that if we do just keep the deregistrations going, and as painful as they are to see some of these subnets that have real code, and nobody wants to see those subnets die off, but nobody wants to see, you know, if you're a miner, you don't want to lose your UID either. But that's the thing that keeps mining competitive. That's the thing that keeps most subnets that are doing things the right way anyway, you know, humming on Bittensor, is that you've got this competitive nature where if anybody, you know, that has a UID slot that's a low performer, that's at the bottom of the heap, and someone comes in and tries to register a slot to join in the mining of the subnet, they can potentially lose their UID at any time. And so I like that mechanism happening at the subnet level. It's painful, but it's good. It's you know, it's this like evolutional. It's an evolutionary type mechanism for me that I feel like that if you just keep chopping down there, you will eventually clear enough, you know, sort of sky for different things to come up that will power this network into, you know, tau into 4 digits and 5 digits and where we all want it to go. So I still don't see any real limits, honestly. And when I think we'll start to feel that when we see really a subnet that is maybe a community favorite, like get deregistered, but I'm not seeing it.
Yeah, I think that's a fair perspective. And talking about the funding rails into Bittensor, like those do exist. There are plenty of organizations and even just individuals who have plenty of tau that are willing to support projects. I guess the question in my mind then, Keith, is what would it take for subnets to go beyond 128? Or should Bittensor remain king of the hill for the foreseeable future, or the king of the 128 hills, if it were?
If the token price really does stabilize, if the tau price stabilizes at a level where the community feels comfortable in increasing that limit, or the governance structure that we talked about on the last podcast, if those leaders feel comfortable expanding that limit, then that's the determining factor, and who I will ride with until the end of my days in this ecosystem, or in the end of my actual days. I don't know. But those are the people that are building on the network. They're the decision makers up to this point. A lot of it's been led by OTF and the founders and the triumvirate, but that's about to expand. And those are who you're here with. Like, that's what you're invested in. So when you have that governance structure that's able to weigh in on these sort of larger, way more impactful decisions long-term for Bittensor, that's what it's there for. So I like that aspect of the governance. And if you're a smaller player and you just want more subnet slots, well, you kind of have to convince those people that that's the way to vote then, because those are the entities that are contributing the most to the project and have earned these spots to influence the direction in which the protocol will go. And so that's where I guess I land on it, is let the governance sort of sort it out.
Well said. Well said.
And all right, wait 1 second. I forgot to mention BitStarter, because that's another option. If you want to fund your subnet, you don't have to go to one of these other entities. You can crowdfund it. They've been 100% successful at this point with all of their funding. So there's that option as well. There's no shortage of options. If you got a great idea and you can code, come to Bittensor. Someone will lay out the yellow brick road for you, and then you have to skip down it, but it's there, you know?
I think that's a great point. Some people might look at the registration fee for a subnet and they think, oh, geez, 480 tau, I don't have that. But someone does have 480 tau that they'll be willing to give to you for a attractive deal into your subnet. And there are plenty of parties. You can shop around. There are people, there are companies. BitStarter is a great place to start to look into that. So I think that's a great point. So if we have these 128 subnets and they're competing for emissions, what do we do about subnets that have 0 emissions but are not getting deregistered because they are maintaining a EMA price, which we talked about earlier in this pod, to be above the lowest, therefore avoiding being on the chopping block? There are a few subnets that are in this position that have no emissions but are sitting pretty right where they are. Keith, not to put you on the spot, but you own one of these subnets. What is your take on the 0 emission subnets that are, at least so far, here to stay?
Yeah, it's actually a quite a large group, and actually I just sorted it by emissions here, and I'm just going to rattle them off. I think it'll actually surprise people. 56 gradients, 5 hone, 41 sports tensor, 50 synth, 48 quantum compute, 33 ready AI, 11 dippy, 77 liquidity, 43 graphite, 45 talisman, 46 resi, Sunday bar 121, mainframe 25, web agents 36, Wahoot 30, Trishul 23. So and actually what's funny is the subnets with 0 emissions are actually some of the more recognizable and kind of, have maybe some of the louder voices on social media. I didn't actually expect that. I've never looked at it from this perspective before. There's a whole mixed bag in here of subnets with 0 emissions. And I think the community probably doesn't need to be worried about those subnets at this point, simply because, I mean, yes, what you have is essentially tau being, I don't want to call it held hostage, but like it's being held in the liquidity pool and it's not doing anything, right? Because these subnets are typically burning minor emissions. They may or may not be developing actively. They could be for sale. And like, I think we have bigger fish to fry than the 0% emission subnets, especially if their price is being sort of maintained, even if their emissions is at 0, but their price is being maintained at a level where they're not being deregistered. That's sort of the game that we're in at this point. And the alternative to this would be creating some sort of governance structure that's going to arbitrarily, or it's going to decide essentially if these subnets need to be, off with their head or not, like, and is that what we want to do, or should we be allowing subnets to exist based solely on the flow of tau in and out, even if that flow has stopped, but the price is at a level where the thing will never get deregistered? Probably, because how, like, when we go back to the point of like what to do with the 128, it's like how many manual interventions do you want to take here on this thing? How many human decisions do you want to bring into determining if something is good or bad? Because this goes back to the thing that everyone will say is code is law, right? And that's, you go back into Discord on Bittensor, and probably it's one of the first things said if you go back 4 or 5 years or whatever. I'm sure it's in there. I've seen Const, Jacob Steve say it before, and I kind of agree with that. Now, if we're going to introduce something to where somehow those subnets that have 0% emissions after a certain amount of time at 0%, like expire, or maybe start like bleeding some tau from their pool, I'm not exactly sure like the mechanism that would have to be introduced in order to light a fire under these, sort of subnets that aren't doing anything, or maybe they're doing something, but the community isn't funding them at this point and their flow is negative. I think there are options. And this is another one that I would put to the governance that needs to be established around this protocol this year, and will be, because it's, the community, I've witnessed it myself, like you said, on Subnet 25, there's varying opinions from, what are you worried about? Just let him do what he wants with it, to like, he's taking up a valuable slot that someone could be building the next shoots on. So like, that may be true. I don't know. Like, if you got rid of all these subnets, that's 20 open slots. But what if within these 0% subnets, you've got, a couple winners in there? So it's a hard decision. Where do you land on it? I'm interested to hear where you land on this one.
Yeah, I think the goal of DTAO, or the kind of premise of DTAO, is that the market decides the winners and losers. And this is kind of an interesting case where the market is deciding to do nothing. The market is deciding to not make this particular subnet a winner nor a loser. It's not a winner in the sense that it's not hogging emissions, but it's not a winner or a loser in the sense that it's not getting deregged. And so what does that mean? What is the market telling us? I think it's telling us a little bit of confidence in who is occupying the slot, and a little bit of interest or intrigue into what is coming next. I hear a lot of chatter about 19, for example, and I know that Mog and the Tau Stats team, they are doing something over there. I don't know what, but something is happening, and people are interested there. And I think that that is kind of this limbo state that these subnets are in. But the market is telling us that these are not subnets that deserve nothing, that deserve to not be a part of this ecosystem. They don't deserve to really gain emissions, because that is reserved for high tau flow subnets. But when you have subnets that don't have a lot of buying nor selling activity, the market is basically saying, I'm going to just park right where I'm at, and I'm going to wait and see what happens. And I think there's a lot of anticipation with these subnets. And I think that people have learned not to overhype an inactive subnet. In the early days of DTAO, I think a lot of people were doing that. They're just buying subnets just because there's a new subnet coming out, and people didn't even know what the subnet was about, but people were buying into it. I don't think people are doing that as much anymore, but that doesn't mean that they're just dumping either. So I think these are opportunities. We'll see what comes from these subnet slots, but I think the people that are holding these slots have some tricks up their sleeves, or they have some relationship that they can use to leverage these subnets to do something interesting. And I think that's kind of what the market is waiting for. So I'm going to let it pan out.
Yeah, 19's an interesting example because it's not on this list, of course, because 19's emissions are basically exactly what its price is at this point, if I'm not mistaken. But it's definitely not on the 0% emissions list. So, like, 19's a good example where, like, and I think Mog himself would say, like, was looking at Subnet 5, I think, for a while and thinking, like, well, Subnet 5 is getting a lot of emissions, but they're not doing anything. Why should they be getting all those emissions? And one of my replies to him was like, Mog, if you had a subnet that wasn't doing anything, it would be doing great if people knew that you owned it. And then, a couple of months later, here we are with 19, and that has come to pass. Now, like, this is the same, and the thing I would always say with this too is, like, if you knew that XYZ founder, you knew Elon was starting a company and you could buy his random, Z stock or something, and then you don't even know what the company was going to do. Like, what would the valuation be? Probably going to the tens of billions or hundreds of billions for sure. Like, people would just be throwing money at it because that person has established a certain level of trust, like you said, within the investor community in general or whatever. And Bittensor is no different than that. There's I just counted it up roughly. There's over 200,000 tau locked in the liquidity pools of these subnets that have 0% emissions going to them. So those subnets, those liquidity pools aren't currently growing, other than if people are like swapping in, I don't know, slowly or randomly or whatever, but it's not growing through emissions anyway. Yeah, it's a hard one. It's a hard one. It's one of the not really casualties, but it's just one of the realities that you deal with being on something that has emissions, like a blockchain or like Bittensor. It's not like the real world where people are just getting, money thrown at them, at least at least if they're not from the state of Minnesota. I don't know. But like these situations that we find ourselves in, this is like, we're breaking ground here. This is fun stuff to talk about. It's awesome to see this evolve. You're seeing the governance like pop up around it to like shore up the thing in all the areas where we maybe have sprung a leak, or maybe not even a leak. We just see a potential problem coming. And this, all of these questions that we've talked about today, I really think like are just the evolution of Bittensor in action. And it's guys like you that are, doing the heavy lifting, guys like me that are giving their opinion and, investing in these subnets and moving alpha in and out or whatever. And it's a beautiful thing to watch. And again, like, this project is in a better spot than I've ever seen it before, even with all these, quote, problems or things that we've seen pop up in the last, 11 months with dynamic tau. It's a great thing to be a part of, and I love talking about this stuff. And I don't know what's going to come in 2026 now that we're into it, but I'm sure we're going to run into another couple dozen of these, like roadblocks, speed bumps, or just like things we didn't conceive, exploits we didn't conceive of. Subnet owners deal with it all the time with their code. The protocols, of course, still dealing with it all the time. And I think what it means for the average person that's listening to this is just opportunity. You have the chance to, just like you can buy these subnets that are empty sort of slots that, you think that some guy might do something great with it, but it doesn't have a plan at the moment. You can speculate on that. Bittensor at its current sort of value, in my opinion, is still ripe for sort of that speculation, and it's because that we're still evolving in all these different areas. And you're just, when you decide to come play with Bittensor, you're betting on guys like, Garrett and the team at OTF and Latent and the BitStarter guys and all the subnet owners and everybody involved in Tau Stats, to just like make sure this thing goes right. And every time I see something funny happen, we make a really good decision around it, and everything gets just a little bit better, and then we move on to the next thing. And so it's been a cool year in 2025 for sure. The most like impactful, eventful, highest screen time, for Bittensor year for me, definitely. But it's been really rewarding to watch us evolve too.
Well said, Keith. And let's end it there. So, everybody, this has been the carrot and the stick with your favorite root vegetable and your favorite pointy object, Garrett and Keith.
See you guys.
See you guys.